The plane was ready for takeoff, the gentle hum of the engines vibrating softly beneath Ethan Mitchell's feet. He sat quietly in his first-class seat, fingers gripping tightly around his boarding pass, as if it might suddenly disappear. His heart beat quickly, not from fear, but from the pure, unfiltered excitement that came with experiencing something extraordinary for the first time. It wasn't just any flight. It was his very first journey alone. A reward from his father, Robert Mitchell, who owned the airline, for acing all his exams. This flight represented more than luxury or comfort. It symbolized trust, pride, and the acknowledgement of his hard-earned achievements. Ethan took a deep breath, glancing around the spacious first-class cabin. Plush leather seats stretched comfortably, wide and inviting, the cabin illuminated softly by warm golden lighting. Flight attendants moved effortlessly from row to row, their polished uniforms crisp, their smiles welcoming. Passengers around him seemed casual, used to the luxury he was only just beginning to savor. Businessmen adjusted their cuffs while casually flipping through newspapers. Women in elegant dresses sipped from chilled glasses, their conversations quiet and relaxed. Ethan felt the thrilling novelty of belonging somewhere special, somewhere he had always dreamed about, but never imagined he'd actually experience so soon. He gazed out of the small oval window beside him, taking in the busy activity of the airport runway below. Trucks and personnel moving in a choreographed dance. The boarding pass in his hand was proof of his accomplishment, a tangible reminder that all those late nights studying, all the meticulous preparation, had been worth it. He imagined his father's proud face, the subtle nod of approval Robert had given him earlier that morning when he handed over the ticket. "You've earned this, Ethan," he'd said quietly, his eyes warm with pride. Ethan had felt something warm rise in his chest then, a sensation he now carried with him onto the plane. His fingers loosened slightly around the ticket as a gentle announcement crackled overhead, the captain's voice calm and reassuring, welcoming passengers aboard and preparing everyone for takeoff. Ethan adjusted his seatbelt, ensuring it was securely fastened, feeling oddly proud he had remembered all the safety instructions his father had always repeated on their family trips. But this was different. This was his trip, his responsibility. He belonged here, and he knew it. He leaned back slightly, his head resting comfortably against the seat, closing his eyes briefly as he imagined the journey ahead. The exhilarating liftoff, the clouds beneath him, and the quiet tranquility of traveling alone in luxury. He could almost feel the plane rising, leaving everything behind, climbing into the endless sky. It was a perfect moment, suspended between anticipation and reality. A moment he knew he'd always remember. But the perfection of the moment didn't last. Ethan's eyes flickered open at the sharp click of heels approaching down the aisle. He glanced up to see a flight attendant, her name tag reading Claire Foster, glinting under the soft lights, standing above him. Her uniform was crisp, her posture professional and controlled, but something about her eyes gave him pause. They were cool, distant, the faintest hint of suspicion flickering within them. "Excuse me, young man," she began, her voice sharp enough to slice through Ethan's contentment. Her hands were placed firmly on her hips as she looked down at him, her expression unreadable but unsettling. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" For a moment, Ethan was too startled to reply. He glanced around, noticing heads subtly turning, passengers sneaking glances, quickly turning back to their phones or newspapers, pretending not to watch but clearly aware. He swallowed, suddenly unsure, the ticket clenched tightly once again in his hand. "Yes, ma'am," he answered politely, the words coming out softer than he intended. "Seat 3B. Claire barely glanced at the ticket he held out to her, shaking her head almost immediately, her lips pressed into a thin line, skepticism clear in her eyes. "This is a first-class seat," she stated bluntly, her voice loud enough to carry to those sitting nearby. Ethan felt heat rise up his neck, embarrassment prickling along his skin. "I know," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady, sitting up straighter in an attempt to regain some dignity. "My ticket says—" "Where are your parents?" Claire interrupted abruptly, her tone shifting slightly, impatience beginning to creep in. Her eyes narrowed as she examined him again, as though trying to see something that would confirm her suspicion. Ethan felt his stomach tighten, a sense of discomfort mixing with his confusion. "I'm traveling alone," he answered softly, sensing the unease from the other passengers around him. Their silence was loud, heavy with judgment. No one spoke up, no one intervened. They watched quietly, eyes carefully averted, but listening closely. Claire straightened her shoulders, adjusting her posture as though bracing herself for a confrontation. "I see," she said curtly, her voice clipped. "Unfortunately, there must have been a mistake. This seat is reserved exclusively for first-class passengers." Ethan blinked, confusion spreading through him rapidly. "I am a first-class passenger," he repeated, his voice now tinged with frustration, though he still remained respectful. He couldn't understand why she didn't believe him, why she wouldn't even glance carefully at his boarding pass. Claire's smile tightened, forced politeness stretched thin over irritation. "I think there's been some confusion," she insisted firmly, her voice leaving no room for argument. "You need to take your things and move to economy." A heavy hush settled over the surrounding rows. The businessman beside Ethan shifted slightly, turning a newspaper page, but Ethan noticed the man's eyes flicker toward him briefly, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. A woman 2 seats ahead adjusted her sunglasses slightly, glancing discreetly but remaining silent. Everyone seemed frozen, waiting to see what he would do. Ethan hesitated, his cheeks burning, his throat feeling suddenly tight. He had never felt this small, this unwanted. He glanced down at his ticket again, desperate, hoping perhaps the numbers and letters might rearrange themselves to confirm he had indeed made a mistake. But no. There it was clearly printed. "Seat 3B, first class. This is my seat," he murmured, trying one last time to insist gently, holding up the ticket again. Claire sighed audibly, clearly irritated, her patience rapidly thinning. "Sir?" "I'm asking you nicely," she snapped, no longer bothering to mask her annoyance. "You need to move." Ethan felt the gazes of the passengers around him, their unspoken assumptions settling heavily upon him. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was being publicly accused, embarrassed, and told loudly and clearly that he did not belong. His heart hammered painfully in his chest, a mix of humiliation and confusion washing over him. Slowly, reluctantly, Ethan reached down, grabbed his small backpack and stood. His legs felt unsteady, weak beneath him as he stepped into the aisle. Claire didn't offer any assistance, instead turning sharply and motioning toward the back of the plane. "Right this way," she said curtly. Ethan walked silently past the rows of first-class seats, past passengers who had watched everything unfold but had chosen silence. His eyes stayed forward, his head held high despite the painful burn of embarrassment in his chest. He wouldn't let them see his face clearly, wouldn't let them see how deeply this moment hurt. As he moved further back toward the economy section, Ethan's fingers tightened around his backpack, the boarding pass still clenched tightly in his fist. A painful reminder of how quickly his pride and excitement had turned into humiliation and disappointment. The silence on the plane felt deafening as Ethan stood awkwardly in the aisle, gripping his backpack, his boarding pass still crumpled tightly in his hand. His heart hammered painfully against his ribs, not with the joyful anticipation he'd felt just moments ago, but with a deep, gnawing sense of humiliation. The entire first-class cabin felt as though it had shrunk around him, the previously welcoming space now pressing in, filled with judgment and disbelief. Claire Foster stood before him, her posture rigid and unyielding, her eyes cold and assessing as she gestured impatiently toward the rear of the plane. "Come on now," she snapped, her voice icy and authoritative, her gaze never softening even slightly. "Move along. You're holding everyone up." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry, the embarrassment prickling sharply behind his eyes. He desperately wanted to say something more, to argue, to insist once again that he belonged right where he was standing, in seat 3B. But he couldn't. Something in Claire's eyes silenced him. an intimidating certainty that made his words catch in his throat. She didn't even bother glancing at his boarding pass again, already convinced that Ethan simply did not belong. "Please," he tried once more, his voice low and polite, even though every fiber of his being screamed silently at the injustice unfolding. "My ticket clearly says—" "I don't need to check again," Claire cut him off sharply, raising one perfectly manicured hand as though to physically stop his words from reaching her. "I've been doing this job for many years, and I know exactly what's going on here. This seat isn't for you." She didn't shout. She didn't have to. Her voice carried through the cabin like a cold breeze, clear and cutting, ensuring that every passenger nearby heard each word distinctly. Around them, passengers shifted uncomfortably, their eyes flickering quickly between Ethan and Claire. A businessman seated directly beside Ethan fidgeted slightly with his cufflinks, his expression uneasy. Ethan caught his eye for just a moment, a pleading glance exchanged, silently begging for intervention, for some support. The man hesitated, his mouth opening slightly as though to speak, to challenge what was happening, but he stopped abruptly, his eyes dropping in shameful silence. Ethan felt something inside him wilt, a tiny flame of hope extinguished by that silent refusal to help. Across the aisle, a woman wearing oversized dark sunglasses turned her head abruptly, deliberately avoiding eye contact, focusing instead on the small magazine resting in her lap. Ethan knew she was aware of what was happening, could see the tension in her posture, the subtle shift of discomfort as she tried to remain indifferent. He wished she would look up, wished she would say something, anything, to ease the shame flooding through him. But she remained stubbornly silent, hidden behind dark lenses. Behind them, an elderly passenger stirred slightly, leaning forward as if preparing to say something. Ethan saw the older man's expression soften, eyes reflecting a gentle sadness, a clear recognition of the injustice taking place. The man's lips parted, as if a comforting or corrective word might finally be spoken, but the hesitation lingered painfully. After a moment, the elderly passenger sighed deeply, the air heavy with regret and resignation, and sank back slowly into his seat, leaving Ethan feeling even more isolated and betrayed. Ethan glanced once more at Claire, desperation shining clearly in his eyes. She simply raised her chin slightly, an unspoken challenge reflected in her hardened gaze. No one would defend him. No one would intervene. Ethan understood this with sudden, painful clarity. He had no choice but to accept this moment of humiliation, even though every instinct told him this was profoundly unfair. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, forced out of the seat that belonged to him, stripped of dignity, and forced to walk to a place that felt like exile. Slowly feeling every pair of eyes burn into his back, Ethan turned toward the rear of the aircraft, clutching his backpack tighter to his chest. Each step felt impossibly heavy, as if invisible weights had been tied to his ankles, dragging him down to a place he was told he belonged. His breathing became shallow, rapid, a pressure building behind his eyes that he fought desperately to control. He wouldn't cry, not here, not in front of everyone. As Ethan passed through the first-class cabin, he could hear the faint whispers begin, hushed conversations behind cupped hands, passengers exchanging quick, uncomfortable glances as though silently acknowledging their complicity. Their refusal to intervene was almost as hurtful as Claire's harsh dismissal. Their silence felt like agreement, confirmation of Claire's judgment, confirmation that he didn't belong here. Ethan tried not to let them see how deeply the whispers hurt him, how each muttered word felt like another tiny cut, slowly eroding his self-esteem and confidence. Stepping from the plush luxury of first class into the narrower, tighter confines of economy felt like crossing an invisible barrier, a line that he had been unfairly forced to cross. He lowered himself slowly into an empty seat near the window, gripping the armrests as though to steady himself against the tidal wave of shame and confusion threatening to overwhelm him. Around him, economy passengers paid little attention, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded just a few feet away. Ethan stared down at his hands, now trembling slightly, and realized he was still clutching his boarding pass so tightly it had become crumpled and damp from the sweat of his palms. He slowly smoothed the ticket against his leg, carefully examining it once more. Seat 3B, first class. There had been no mistake. He belonged exactly where he had been sitting, exactly where he had been removed from. Yet, he had no power to prove it, no voice to make Claire Foster or anyone else believe him. He felt utterly powerless, stripped bare of the excitement and pride he had carried aboard this aircraft. Instead, Ethan now sat alone, abandoned by everyone around him, including those who had quietly witnessed the injustice but chose silence. Claire's cold dismissal replayed relentlessly in his mind, her words etching themselves painfully into his memory, leaving scars he feared would remain long after this flight had ended. Ethan took a deep breath, struggling to calm the painful turmoil within. He blinked rapidly, refusing to let tears fall, refusing to let Claire or anyone else witness the depth of his hurt. But inside, beneath the carefully controlled exterior, something had fractured. A sense of innocence shattered by harsh judgment and unfair accusation. He looked down at his phone, fingers trembling slightly as he began typing a brief, heartbreaking message to his father. Each letter felt like an admission of defeat, a plea for help he wished he didn't have to send. "Dad, they moved me to the back. The flight attendant said I didn't belong in first class. She didn't even look at my ticket. What should I do?" He pressed send, watching the message disappear into cyberspace, carrying with it all his hurt and humiliation, silently hoping that somehow his father's response might fix everything that had gone terribly, horribly wrong. Ethan sank deeper into his seat, the cramped space of the economy section pressing tightly against his sides, a stark contrast to the comfort and space he'd briefly enjoyed moments before. He glanced around, feeling suddenly invisible, lost in the quiet hum of casual conversations and the low drone of the airplane engines. The events in first class replayed over and over in his mind, each harsh word from Claire Foster cutting deeper into his consciousness, embedding themselves like splinters beneath his skin. He stared numbly down at his phone, the screen glowing faintly in his shaking hands. It felt surreal, almost impossible, that he had ended up here. His first flight alone, once filled with excitement and pride, now overshadowed by a sense of confusion and hurt that he struggled to comprehend. His fingers hovered hesitantly over the keypad, his mind racing to form the right words, the right message to send to his father. He felt a wave of embarrassment at having to reach out for help, a shame that this moment of triumph had somehow turned into humiliation. Taking a shaky breath, Ethan slowly began typing, each tap of his fingers feeling heavy and uncertain. His message was short, simple, but each word carried the weight of his hurt. "Dad, they made me move to economy. The flight attendant said I didn't belong in first class. She didn't even check my ticket. What do I do?" He read the message again, eyes lingering over the phrase, "I didn't belong." Each time he reread it, the words hurt more, digging deeper into his sense of self-worth. He felt an uncomfortable burning sensation behind his eyes, but he refused to let any tears fall. He pressed send, a quick, decisive movement, and the screen confirmed that the message was delivered. For several painful seconds, Ethan stared at his phone, his heart racing with nervous anticipation. Would his father believe him? Would Robert Mitchell, the calm, composed, and powerful man Ethan admired more than anyone else, understand how deeply he had been wounded? Would he be disappointed? Ethan shook his head slightly, forcing himself to breathe slowly and evenly. His father had always been there for him. This wouldn't be any different, he told himself firmly, even though his hands still shook slightly with anxiety. Almost immediately, the phone vibrated softly in his palm. Ethan's heart jumped sharply as he saw his father's name flash across the screen. He quickly unlocked the phone, eyes wide with anticipation as he read the short, concise message that followed. "Who did this? "What's the flight number?" The response was rapid, precise, and focused, exactly the way Robert Mitchell always responded in difficult situations. No panic, no unnecessary emotion, just swift action. Ethan hesitated only for a brief moment before quickly typing back, the small keys of his phone feeling slick under his fingertips. The flight attendant, Claire Foster, Flight 297. He hit send again, feeling a mix of relief and nervousness swirling uncomfortably within him. He knew his father well enough to recognize that the simplicity and directness of his response meant Robert was already planning his next steps. Robert Mitchell wasn't a man who tolerated unfairness, especially when it involved someone he loved. Another message vibrated quickly onto the screen, interrupting Ethan's tense thoughts. The words were firm, yet reassuring. "Stay calm. Stay exactly where you are. I'll handle this. Don't say anything else to her. Understood." Ethan's chest loosened slightly, relief washing over him as he absorbed the strength and reassurance woven clearly through his father's words. Robert Mitchell's messages had always been clear, direct, yet beneath their brevity, Ethan could always sense the deep current of love and protectiveness that his father rarely voiced, but consistently demonstrated through action. Ethan replied quickly, his anxiety easing slightly as he typed, "Understood, Dad. I'll stay here." There was a pause, a few heartbeats, where Ethan waited, wondering if there would be anything further. Then another quick vibration, a short, gentle reminder from his father appeared on the screen. "I'm proud of you. Everything will be okay, Ethan. Just trust me." Those final words lingered on the screen, illuminating Ethan's face in the soft blue glow of his phone. Ethan exhaled deeply, releasing tension he hadn't fully realized he was holding. He had needed to hear that. He needed his father's unwavering support and confidence to steady the shaky foundation beneath him, to remind him that he hadn't done anything wrong, that he had nothing to be ashamed of. He slowly placed the phone onto his lap, his fingers loosening their tight grip, feeling more grounded, more secure with each passing moment. The noise of the airplane cabin returned gradually to his consciousness, the gentle murmurs of passengers, the occasional muffled laughter, the soft hum of the engines beneath his feet. But now they felt distant, disconnected. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, leaning back against the seat, allowing himself a moment of calm, quiet relief. But even in that moment, he couldn't shake the lingering feelings of confusion and pain from Claire's harsh dismissal. Despite his father's comforting words, Ethan still felt the sting of humiliation, the wound from being publicly embarrassed and accused unfairly. He opened his eyes slowly, looking out through the tiny oval window beside him, gazing out into the endless stretch of sky, hoping somehow to lose himself briefly in the peaceful serenity of the clouds. Yet the peaceful view only brought the stark contrast of the injustice into sharper focus. Ethan knew deep inside that what had happened wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was something deeper, something painful he had never experienced before, something unfair and unkind, something he hoped no one else would ever have to endure. Ethan's phone vibrated one last time, breaking gently into his quiet reflection. He glanced down, reading one final short message from his father. "I've just contacted the airline. The captain will speak to her directly. Sit tight." Ethan felt a quiet thrill of satisfaction, knowing that his father was now in control. Robert Mitchell wasn't a man who raised his voice, who lost his temper, or who made empty threats. He acted swiftly, decisively, always driven by fairness and respect. Ethan knew Claire Foster had made a critical mistake, one she would soon realize was far greater than she imagined. His father's brief messages had conveyed powerfully that Ethan was not alone, that someone with authority knew, understood, and would act quickly to correct the injustice. Ethan slowly relaxed back into his seat again, reassured by the strength behind his father's words. The pain and embarrassment from earlier still lingered, of course, like a bruise beneath the surface, but now it was tempered by something stronger, faith and trust in his father's unwavering support. He wasn't sure what would happen next exactly, But Ethan felt a calm certainty now that everything would soon be set right. Robert Mitchell's quiet power and firm resolve would ensure it. Ethan closed his eyes once more, this time breathing more easily, waiting patiently as his father had instructed. There was nothing left for him to do now but wait and trust. He felt the steady hum of the aircraft engines beneath him, carrying him forward toward resolution, toward justice, toward a moment when the dignity Claire Foster had stripped from him would finally be restored. From the moment Ethan had boarded the plane, Hannah Brooks had noticed him, standing quietly in the galley area, arranging neatly stacked trays and preparing drinks for the passengers. Hannah had observed the young boy's initial excitement, the way he carefully held his boarding pass, his posture brimming with pride. There was something genuine and innocent about him, a freshness that stood out among the seasoned business travelers and wealthy vacationers who frequented the first-class cabin. Hannah had smiled quietly to herself, recognizing the kind of joyful anticipation that she herself had felt years ago on her first flight. But now, as she watched Claire Foster's sharp exchange with Ethan unfold, Hannah felt an uneasiness settle in the pit of her stomach. Standing slightly out of sight, her eyes flickered anxiously between the young passenger and her senior colleague, the tension between them radiating outward like ripples in still water. Claire's voice had sliced through the quiet cabin, authoritative and unyielding, as she demanded that Ethan vacate the seat. Hannah saw the boy's confusion, the genuine disbelief etched onto his young face, and felt an immediate wave of sympathy. Ethan had shown Claire his boarding pass. Hannah had clearly seen it, yet Claire hadn't even bothered to look carefully. Hannah's hands paused momentarily in their preparations, fingers tightening imperceptibly around the edges of a serving tray as she watched Ethan walk slowly and painfully down the aisle toward the economy section. Hannah felt deeply unsettled, troubled by the injustice of the scene she had just witnessed. She had worked alongside Claire Foster before and had grown accustomed to her confident, sometimes overly assertive style. Claire had always been direct and decisive, often praised by supervisors for her ability to handle difficult passengers efficiently. But something was different this time. This wasn't an unruly traveler causing trouble, or someone intentionally violating a rule. Ethan had done nothing wrong, yet Claire's treatment had been severe, unfair, and dismissive. She looked back toward Claire, who had returned to the galley, rearranging menus and glasses with a cold, detached efficiency that suddenly made Hannah uncomfortable. Claire's face was composed, revealing no regret, no second thoughts, only a quiet satisfaction at having resolved what she clearly considered an inconvenience. Hannah hesitated, watching her colleague work, before finally gathering the courage to speak. "Claire," Hannah began softly, her voice gentle but firm enough to cut through the silence. She approached slowly, heart beating rapidly, unsure how her colleague would react to being questioned. Claire glanced up briefly, her eyes distant and distracted. "Yes?" she replied tersely, continuing to shuffle menus, barely registering Hannah's presence. Hannah steadied herself, breathing carefully as she chose her words with deliberate calmness. "I saw the whole thing," she said, her voice still gentle but unmistakably clear. "You didn't even check the boy's boarding pass. How can you be so sure he doesn't belong here?" Claire paused abruptly, the menus frozen mid-motion in her hand, a faint crease appearing between her carefully plucked eyebrows. For a fleeting second, something flickered in her eyes. A tiny moment of uncertainty, an almost imperceptible crack in her confident exterior. But the vulnerability disappeared almost instantly, replaced quickly by defensiveness and irritation. "Hannah," Claire responded curtly, her voice carrying a thinly veiled annoyance. "I've been doing this job longer than you've been here. Trust me, I know exactly when someone doesn't belong." Claire resumed her movements briskly, but now they were less smooth, her hands trembling ever so slightly as she rearranged trays that didn't need rearranging. Hannah noticed, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "Claire," Hannah persisted gently, "I understand you're experienced, but he had a ticket. He even showed it to you. What if we're wrong about this? Claire turned sharply, eyes flashing, the menus slamming softly against the countertop. We aren't wrong, she insisted forcefully, though her voice wavered slightly, betraying the uncertainty creeping in at the edges of her resolve. I handle these situations all the time. I have to rely on my instincts. This is my responsibility. Are you seriously questioning my judgment right now? Hannah swallowed, heart hammering beneath her neatly pressed uniform. I'm not trying to question you personally, she replied carefully. I'm just saying, maybe instincts aren't always enough. Maybe sometimes we need to take a closer look before we make a decision like that. Claire's mouth tightened visibly, a deep furrow now clearly etched between her brows. She inhaled sharply, eyes narrowing as though trying to see clearly through the haze of doubt Hannah's words had stirred within her. You think I was unfair? Claire challenged, her voice quieter now but edged with defensiveness. Do you honestly believe I would just randomly single out a passenger? Hannah met Claire's gaze directly, her voice still gentle but unflinching in its honesty. I'm not accusing you, Claire, but we're human. We all have biases, we all make assumptions. If we don't double-check ourselves, we risk hurting people who haven't done anything to deserve it. I just don't think it's right. Claire's shoulders tensed visibly, her face flushing slightly as Hannah's words sank deeper into her consciousness. The doubt Hannah's gentle questioning had planted was beginning to grow, spreading through Claire's thoughts like ink dropped slowly into clear water. For the first time since the incident had occurred, Claire replayed the moment in her mind clearly. The startled expression on Ethan's face, the crumpled boarding pass in his small hand, the quiet but unmistakable dignity with which he'd left the first-class cabin. Hannah's careful, steady voice had forced Claire to confront the uncomfortable possibility that she might indeed have made a mistake rooted not in experience or professionalism, but perhaps in something deeper, something Claire didn't want to admit, even to herself. She turned abruptly, breaking eye contact, suddenly busying herself again with trivial tasks, desperately trying to regain the composure that Hannah's quiet intervention had shattered. This conversation is over, Claire muttered tersely, her voice barely audible. Hannah nodded quietly, respecting Claire's withdrawal, but inwardly she knew her words had made an impact. She stepped away slowly, returning to her own tasks, heart heavy but conscience clearer. Her gentle challenge had opened the door, forcing Claire, no matter how reluctantly, to confront the possibility of her own bias, her own mistake. As Hannah resumed quietly preparing drinks, she glanced back toward the economy section, where Ethan now sat silently, no doubt confused and hurt. Her heart ached at the injustice the boy had suffered. Hannah resolved silently that even though she had not intervened directly during the incident, she would find a way to support Ethan if she could. Her quiet voice had already made Claire reflect, and perhaps that small victory was the first step toward justice and understanding. But for now, Hannah could only watch and wait, knowing she had done something small, yet significant. She had spoken the truth, quietly and gently, planting seeds of doubt in Claire's previously unshakable conviction, and as she continued her duties, Hannah hoped deeply that those seeds would grow into reflection, awareness, and ultimately, change. Claire Foster had just finished rearranging the neatly stacked drink menus, trying desperately to regain control over her turbulent emotions after Hannah's quiet yet piercing words. She felt shaken, the tightness in her chest slowly giving way to uncertainty she had rarely allowed herself to feel. She was about to pour herself a quick glass of water to steady her nerves when the intercom suddenly crackled to life, interrupting her thoughts sharply. "Claire Foster, please report to the cockpit immediately," came Captain Daniel Everett's voice, calm and professional, yet carrying an unusual seriousness that instantly sent a chill down Claire's spine. She froze momentarily, her fingers tightening around the small plastic cup in her hand. Claire had been summoned to the cockpit before, of course, usually for routine updates or quick consultations with the pilots. But something in Captain Everett's tone hinted clearly that this was no ordinary call. A subtle unease prickled along her skin, making the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. She glanced quickly toward Hannah, who stood silently at the edge of the galley, her face carefully neutral. But Claire saw the brief flicker of concern in Hannah's eyes, confirming her own uneasy intuition. Something serious had just unfolded. Claire straightened her uniform reflexively, smoothing the crisp fabric with trembling fingers, attempting to present a confident facade she no longer felt inside. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to regain composure as she stepped out of the galley, moving quickly yet gracefully down the aisle toward the cockpit. Passengers barely looked up from their magazines or tablets, oblivious to the turmoil that surged through her with each step she took. Claire's heart thudded painfully as she approached the cockpit door. She hesitated briefly before knocking gently, the metallic echo seeming louder than usual. The cockpit door unlocked with a faint click, and she stepped inside quickly, feeling the immediate intimacy of the small, confined space. Captain Everett turned toward her slowly, his usually calm expression unusually tense. His co-pilot kept his gaze carefully forward, as though purposefully distancing himself from whatever was about to transpire. Claire's eyes darted quickly around, sensing immediately that something was deeply wrong. Then she noticed a small screen glowing softly to one side. A video call active. The face of a man staring directly at her, his expression composed but eyes dark with quiet intensity. "Claire Foster?" The captain's voice was soft yet clear, instantly commanding her full attention. "Yes, Captain," she answered, her voice betraying only the faintest quiver, but enough for Captain Everett to notice. "Allow me to introduce Mr. Robert Mitchell," Captain Everett continued calmly, his voice revealing nothing but careful neutrality. "The owner of this airline." Claire's stomach plunged sharply, as if the floor had suddenly disappeared beneath her feet. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, drowning out the gentle hum of the airplane's controls around her. Her eyes widened involuntarily, locked onto the calm yet formidable face of Robert Mitchell, a face she knew only vaguely from occasional newsletters and company materials. She had never expected to speak to him personally, certainly not under these circumstances. She felt herself sway slightly, the cockpit walls feeling suddenly oppressive and unbearably close. For a brief moment she wondered absurdly if she might faint right there in front of the pilots and the man whose airline she proudly represented. But Claire forced herself to stand straighter, clutching desperately at the final shreds of her professional composure. "Mr. Mitchell," Claire managed weakly, her voice barely audible, almost lost beneath the soft hum of cockpit instruments. Robert Mitchell's gaze remained steady, unwavering, his voice calm yet edged with unmistakable authority when he finally spoke. "Ms. Foster, I've just received a very distressing message from my son, Ethan. It appears he's been unfairly moved from his rightful seat in first class. He also informed me that you refused to check his ticket and publicly humiliated him in front of other passengers. Is this accurate?" His voice was soft, measured, yet Claire heard the steely resolve that lay beneath the carefully chosen words. Each syllable felt like a precise blow to the carefully constructed shield she had built around herself. Claire felt blood drain rapidly from her face, replaced by a burning embarrassment that crawled up from the base of her neck. "Mr. Mitchell, Claire stammered, her usually confident voice faltering completely, becoming small and uncertain. "I believed." "You believed what, exactly?" Robert Mitchell interrupted, gently yet firmly, allowing no evasion, no excuses. "That my son didn't belong? That he couldn't possibly have a legitimate ticket?" Claire's mouth opened helplessly, unable to find words to justify her actions. The calm, controlled power behind Robert Mitchell's voice dismantled every defense she had previously prepared. It was a painfully clear mirror held up before her, reflecting the uncomfortable truth Hannah had quietly pointed out earlier. Her actions had not been professional. They had been personal and deeply biased. Robert Mitchell leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked onto hers through the small, glowing screen. "Ms. Foster, allow me to make this explicitly clear," he continued, his tone never rising, yet each word carried tremendous weight. "You have insulted and embarrassed my son, who had every right and reason to be seated in first class. Not only that, you disregarded basic company procedure by not verifying his boarding pass carefully. This isn't just a matter of customer service. It's an issue of fundamental respect and fairness." Claire felt her composure crumbling entirely now, the carefully maintained facade shattering like thin ice beneath the weight of Robert Mitchell's clear, decisive words. She blinked, rapidly, desperately attempting to regain control over the tears now threatening to spill from her eyes. "Here's what's going to happen next," Mitchell continued softly, his voice calm yet resolute. "You will personally return my son Ethan to his correct seat immediately, and you will apologize directly to him for your actions. Once this plane lands, I will await a formal explanation from you to our executive team. Do you understand me clearly, Ms. Foster?" Claire could only nod weakly, her throat too constricted by embarrassment and regret to allow words to pass. Her gaze dropped, unable to meet the intensity of Mitchell's steady stare any longer. Captain Everett intervened gently, sensing Claire's complete emotional unraveling. "Thank you, Mr. Mitchell," he said calmly. "I'll ensure your instructions are carried out immediately." Robert Mitchell nodded once, his gaze finally shifting away, the call disconnecting swiftly. The small screen went dark, leaving Claire standing silently, utterly broken by the exchange she had just experienced. Captain Everett turned slightly toward her, his voice quiet but firm. "You heard Mr. Mitchell, Claire," he said, offering no judgment, no reprimand, merely stating facts. "You need to rectify this immediately." Claire nodded again, numbly, stepping back from the cockpit door, the world spinning slightly around her. As the cockpit door clicked softly shut behind her, she felt her shoulders slump forward, a crushing weight of shame pressing heavily upon her chest. She now fully recognized the gravity of her mistake. A mistake that was not just about protocol or customer service, but about dignity, respect, and the basic humanity owed to each passenger. As she moved down the aisle slowly toward Ethan, each step felt heavy, burdened with the painful realization that her actions had not only harmed Ethan, but had damaged the very reputation of the airline she had proudly represented for so long. In this moment, Claire Foster finally understood something deeply unsettling about herself, something she had denied or overlooked until now. And as she approached the economy seat where Ethan sat quietly, head bowed, she knew she was about to confront the harshest truth of all, the difficult reality of apologizing sincerely, openly, and humbly to someone she had unfairly judged. Claire Foster moved slowly back down the aisle, each step heavier than the last. She felt the eyes of the passengers following her quietly, each gaze burning into her consciousness, adding to the weight of her guilt. The comfortable luxury of first class, with its plush leather seats and elegant atmosphere, suddenly felt foreign and hostile. No longer the familiar territory she once confidently dominated. Now she was a stranger here, each step a quiet admission of failure. As she drew closer to the narrow curtain that separated first class from economy, her pulse quickened painfully, each heartbeat echoing sharply in her chest. The boundary she'd created so effortlessly earlier had become a painful reminder of the injustice she'd committed, a silent accusation that she could no longer avoid. Her hands trembled slightly as she gently pushed aside the curtain, stepping carefully into the smaller, tighter space of the economy cabin. There, near the window, Ethan Mitchell sat quietly, staring out at the endless sky, a picture of quiet dignity despite all that had occurred. Claire hesitated, stopping just a few steps away, suddenly feeling acutely small and vulnerable in the young boy's quiet presence. She took a deep, shaky breath, her heart racing painfully with apprehension as she struggled to find the right words that would never fully erase the hurt she'd inflicted. "Ethan," she finally began, her voice soft, almost inaudible. It was a sharp contrast to the confident, authoritative tone she had used earlier. Ethan slowly turned his head, meeting her gaze calmly, with an expression that revealed neither anger nor resentment, only quiet curiosity. Claire swallowed hard, her throat tightening uncomfortably. For the first time in her long career, she found herself completely at a loss for words, stripped bare of all the professional poise she had so carefully cultivated over the years. Standing before this young boy, she felt humbled, forced to confront the uncomfortable truth of her own deep-seated biases and snap judgments. She looked into Ethan's eyes, clear and unwavering, realizing in that moment just how deeply she had wounded him. Not physically, but in a way that cut far deeper, into the quiet dignity of his spirit. "There's been a mistake," Claire said hesitantly, her voice wavering slightly as she struggled for composure. The words felt hollow and inadequate as they left her lips, unable to fully capture the gravity of what she'd done. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He merely observed her carefully, waiting patiently for her to continue. "I'm here to escort you back to your original seat," she continued softly, the sentence trailing off awkwardly. Ethan tilted his head slightly, studying her expression closely. The maturity and calmness in his eyes surprised her, making her heart ache even more intensely. "A mistake," Ethan finally repeated softly, a hint of gentle skepticism in his quiet voice. Claire nodded slowly, her cheeks burning with embarrassment as she struggled to meet his gaze. "Yes, Ethan," she admitted, her voice cracking slightly. "I made a mistake. I'm very sorry." Ethan paused, his gaze never leaving hers, his expression calm yet piercing. After a moment, he spoke again, his words measured and thoughtful. "You didn't check anyone else's ticket in first class," Ethan said gently, his voice calm but firm, each word carrying a quiet authority that belied his young age. "You looked at me, and you decided I didn't belong. I just want to understand why. Can you tell me?" His simple, direct question hung heavily in the air between them, each word ringing painfully clear. Claire felt her composure unravel entirely, her carefully maintained professionalism dissolving in the face of his quiet, honest inquiry. She opened her mouth slightly, trying to formulate a response, but no words came out. The uncomfortable truth stared back at her, unspoken but clearly understood. She had no answer, because the real answer was something deeply shameful, something rooted in assumptions she had made about him at first glance. Claire knew in that painful moment that there was no acceptable justification she could offer, no explanation that could adequately erase the hurt she'd inflicted. The realization left her feeling utterly exposed, vulnerable, and ashamed. Ethan's question had stripped away every excuse, every layer of protection, forcing her to confront the deeply uncomfortable reality of her own unconscious bias. Claire hesitated, her voice small, barely audible. "I don't know." She felt the burning sting of tears forming in her eyes, threatening to spill over as the uncomfortable truth settled painfully within her. Her chest felt tight, each breath coming short and shallow. The silence stretched on, a heavy, unbearable weight between them. Ethan continued to observe her quietly, his young face betraying neither anger nor bitterness, only a quiet, dignified understanding that seemed far beyond his years. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Claire found her voice again, forcing herself to speak the only words she had left. "The truth, Ethan," she began softly, her voice trembling slightly, filled with genuine remorse. "I was wrong, completely and totally wrong, and I don't have any good reason to give you. Nothing I say can justify what I did. I'm truly sorry." The words fell from her lips like quiet admissions of defeat, each syllable carrying the full weight of her regret. Ethan studied her for another quiet moment, his gaze softening slightly, understanding but still deeply thoughtful. "I believe you," he finally replied, his voice quiet, compassionate even in the face of hurt. "But I hope next time you'll think twice before deciding who belongs and who doesn't." Claire felt a wave of humility wash over her, the wisdom and maturity in Ethan's quiet words making her heart ache painfully. She nodded silently, unable to trust herself to speak further without breaking down completely. Ethan picked up his small backpack quietly, standing slowly and stepping out into the aisle beside her. As they walked slowly back toward the first-class cabin together, Claire felt every eye in the cabin on her again, each gaze magnifying her shame. Yet Ethan walked calmly beside her, his head held high, his quiet dignity lending her a measure of comfort and strength. She marveled at how, despite his young age, Ethan had handled this unfair situation with such maturity and grace, teaching her a lesson she would never forget about responsibility, humility, and the painful consequences of unchecked assumptions. Reaching Ethan's original seat in first class, Claire stood awkwardly, unsure what to say next. She could feel the questioning eyes of the passengers still focused upon them, awaiting some final resolution. "If there's anything you need during the flight," Claire began softly, "please let me know." Ethan paused, glancing up at her briefly before taking his seat again. "Thank you," he replied simply, his voice soft, devoid of bitterness, yet carrying a quiet reminder of the lesson learned. Claire stepped back quietly, moving away down the aisle toward the galley, feeling deeply humbled and forever changed by this interaction. She understood now that an apology could not undo what had happened, could not erase the hurt she'd caused. But she also realized that facing her mistake directly, openly admitting the wrong she'd done, was the first step toward meaningful change. In that quiet moment of sincere apology, Claire Foster learned one of the most important lessons of her life. Not simply about professionalism or customer service, but about compassion, respect, and the profound responsibility every person carries in their interactions with others. Returning slowly to the galley, her heart heavy but conscience finally clear, Claire silently vowed never again to allow assumptions or biases to guide her actions. Ethan's quiet dignity and maturity had shown her a better way, a path toward becoming someone who truly valued every individual equally. And though the pain of her mistake would linger, Claire understood deeply that the hardest lessons often become the most important teachers. The wheels touched down gently on the runway, signaling the end of a journey that Claire Foster knew would leave a lasting impact not only on her career, but on her entire perception of herself. As the airplane taxied toward the terminal, passengers began to rise, stretching their arms, collecting their belongings, their quiet conversations filling the cabin once more. Claire remained standing near the galley, a knot of tension tightening painfully in her chest. She felt isolated, exposed, each whispered conversation feeling somehow directed at her, though logic told her that was unlikely. She forced herself to remain calm, eyes cast downward, hands clasped tightly, waiting in quiet dread for what she knew would inevitably follow. The gentle chime signaling the passengers to disembark finally sounded, and Claire watched silently as they filed slowly from the cabin, each step echoing heavily in her ears. Just as the final passengers stepped onto the jet bridge, Claire heard the soft buzz of the intercom, the voice of Captain Daniel Everett, cutting through the silence with cold precision. "Claire Foster, you are requested immediately in the airline operations office. Please disembark after passengers clear." She closed her eyes briefly, heart sinking further, the cold formality of the request amplifying the gravity of what awaited her. Taking a deep breath, she slowly gathered her courage, smoothing her uniform for what felt like the 100th time, her movements mechanical and stiff, void of the confidence she'd once embodied so effortlessly. With one final look around the empty cabin, Claire stepped onto the jet bridge, her footsteps echoing quietly beneath her. The short walk to the airline operations office seemed impossibly long, each step resonating heavily with dread and regret. When Claire finally reached the closed conference room door, she hesitated for only a brief moment before pushing it open gently, stepping inside with quiet resignation. Inside the room, seated at the long, polished table, were two men. Claire immediately recognized Stephen Reynolds, the airline's senior operations manager, a stern, disciplined man known for his uncompromising professionalism. Beside him sat Robert Mitchell, the owner of the airline and Ethan's father, whose presence felt both powerful and deeply personal. Their expressions were unreadable yet intense, making Claire acutely aware of how serious the consequences of her actions had become. "Sit down, Miss Foster," Stephen Reynolds directed quietly, his tone professional but firm. Claire complied immediately, sinking slowly into a chair opposite the two men, feeling smaller than ever beneath their steady, penetrating gazes. Stephen began without preamble, his voice measured and composed. "We've reviewed statements from passengers, crew, and the captain. It appears clear that you acted improperly toward young Ethan Mitchell. Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Claire met his eyes briefly, swallowing hard, her mouth dry. She considered, briefly, how easy it might be to shift blame, to craft an excuse. But she quickly dismissed the thought. Instead, she spoke plainly and honestly, her voice quiet but steady. "I have no excuse," she admitted softly. "What I did was wrong. I made assumptions without evidence. I acted unfairly, and I deeply regret my actions." Stephen nodded slowly, his expression unchanged, but there was a quiet acknowledgement in his eyes, an unspoken respect for her honesty, even if it came too late. Beside him, Robert Mitchell sat forward slightly, his calm voice resonating deeply with authority and dignity. "Miss Foster, I appreciate your honesty," Robert began, his voice measured yet carrying the weight of conviction. "However, it's important you understand clearly that this issue isn't just about professional conduct or airline procedures. It's about how we as human beings choose to treat one another." He paused briefly, meeting Claire's gaze directly. "The decision you made today didn't just hurt my son. It went against the very values this airline proudly represents: respect, dignity, fairness. Each passenger who boards one of our planes places their trust in us, not just to deliver them safely, but to treat them with equal respect, no matter who they are." Claire felt tears threatening once again, his calm, clear words cutting deeply into her conscience, each sentence highlighting the profound damage her careless decision had caused. Robert continued, his voice steady, unyielding yet compassionate. "When you decided my son didn't belong, you didn't just damage his dignity. You damaged something fundamental about the character and values of this airline. This isn't simply a professional matter. It's about personal responsibility and understanding that biases and assumptions can cause deep and lasting harm." Claire nodded slowly, unable to find words to respond, her heart heavy with a genuine remorse she had never experienced so deeply before. The silence hung heavily between them, a quiet acknowledgement of the seriousness and gravity of the situation. Stephen finally spoke again, his voice firm and decisive. "Ms. Foster, effective immediately, you are suspended from active duty pending a thorough review and investigation by the Airline Executive Board. You will be notified of their decision once it's finalized." Claire nodded again, silently accepting the consequences of her actions without protest or defense. She understood clearly that this moment was not merely about punishment or discipline. It was about accountability, about confronting the uncomfortable truths about herself she'd long avoided. She turned quietly toward Robert Mitchell, speaking softly but with sincere humility. "Mr. Mitchell, I understand why you're doing this. I have no defense or justification for my actions. All I can say is that I'm deeply, truly sorry. I've learned something very important today, and I promise that whatever happens next, I will carry this lesson with me and change for the better." Robert met her gaze steadily, his expression softening slightly with understanding. "I appreciate your sincerity, Ms. Foster," he replied gently. "The true measure of any of us isn't simply in the mistakes we make, but in how honestly we face them, and whether we choose to grow afterward. I genuinely hope you will." With those final words, Robert and Stephen stood, signaling clearly the conclusion of their meeting. Claire rose slowly, quietly leaving the conference room, stepping back into the quiet, sterile hallway of the airport terminal. She felt utterly drained yet oddly relieved, as though a heavy burden she hadn't fully recognized had finally been lifted. As she walked slowly toward the employee exit, each step resonating deeply with the echo of Robert Mitchell's powerful words, Claire Foster understood clearly that her life had changed profoundly in these past hours. She had confronted something deeply uncomfortable about herself, something she now knew she had a profound responsibility to change. She realized that true responsibility wasn't about being perfect or never making mistakes. It was about owning up honestly when those mistakes inevitably occurred. It was about recognizing deeply ingrained assumptions and biases, confronting them head-on, and choosing a different path moving forward. Claire stepped outside into the cool evening air, feeling the gentle breeze brush across her skin, carrying with it a sense of hope she hadn't expected to find. She understood now that this suspension wasn't the end. It was a chance to begin anew, to rebuild herself into someone more aware, more compassionate, more respectful. She had learned a painful but vital lesson today, not simply about being a better flight attendant, but about becoming a better person. Claire Foster silently promised herself in that quiet moment beneath the open sky that she would never again allow assumptions or biases to shape her interactions with others. And though the journey ahead would undoubtedly be challenging, she felt a newfound resolve, a quiet determination born of humility and growth, guiding her gently forward into the future. Claire stepped out of the airline's operations office, the quiet click of the door behind her echoing softly in her ears. She felt raw, exposed, and humbled, a stark contrast from the confident, authoritative figure she'd always prided herself on being. The vast hallway stretched before her, strangely empty, the low hum of distant airport activity a gentle, constant reminder of life continuing around her. Her heart felt heavy yet oddly relieved, as though confronting the painful truth of her mistake had lifted a burden she hadn't known she was carrying. She walked slowly through the terminal, each step thoughtful, measured. Passengers bustled around her, pulling their luggage, greeting family members, laughing and chatting obliviously, unaware of the quiet transformation taking place within her. Claire felt a sense of distance from it all, reflecting deeply on Robert Mitchell's powerful words and the profound lesson she'd learned through her interaction with Ethan. Then, as if guided by fate itself, Claire looked up and stopped suddenly in her tracks. Just ahead, standing by a large window overlooking the busy runways, were Robert Mitchell and Ethan. They were quietly speaking to one another, Robert gently placing a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. Ethan glanced up at his father, nodding thoughtfully, a small smile forming on his lips. Claire hesitated, heart beating faster, unsure whether to approach or quietly walk away. Before she could make that decision, Ethan turned his head slightly and spotted her standing there. Their eyes met briefly, and Ethan smiled softly. A smile that carried no anger, no bitterness, only a quiet maturity that instantly filled Claire with awe. Ethan said something quietly to his father, and Robert turned to see Claire, his expression calm, serious, but without hostility. Claire took a deep breath, stepping forward slowly. She stopped a respectful distance away, unsure how to begin, unsure even of what exactly she intended to say. Ethan moved forward first, his quiet dignity surprising Claire once again. His voice was gentle but clear, each word chosen with thoughtful care. "Ms. Foster." "Claire," he began softly, eyes calm, compassionate beyond his years. "I just wanted you to know something important." Claire felt her throat tighten, eyes glistening slightly as she listened to him speak. "Everybody makes mistakes," Ethan continued, looking up at her earnestly. "What's important is not that we never make mistakes, but that we learn from them. I forgive you, Miss Foster. I really do." Claire's breath caught in her throat, tears she'd been holding back finally slipping down her cheeks as Ethan's words washed over her. She had expected anger, resentment, maybe even silence. But Ethan's quiet forgiveness touched something deeply within her, something vulnerable and sincere, something that words alone could not adequately express. Robert Mitchell stepped forward slightly, his expression still firm, clearly acknowledging the seriousness of the situation, yet his gaze softened as he regarded Claire. Their eyes met briefly, and he nodded gently, a simple gesture, yet powerful in its meaning. It was a gesture of understanding, forgiveness tempered by responsibility. "Thank you, Ethan," Claire whispered softly, her voice trembling slightly with genuine emotion. "You're right. What I did today wasn't just wrong. It was a chance for me to learn something important. I promise you, I will never forget this lesson." Ethan nodded quietly, smiling once more, a quiet maturity and wisdom radiating gently from him. Robert placed a gentle hand again on his son's shoulder, guiding him slowly away. They moved quietly down the terminal, leaving Claire standing alone, her heart lighter, clearer, and stronger than before. As they disappeared into the crowd, Claire stood silently, reflecting on everything that had happened. Ethan's words echoed softly in her mind, gently comforting yet powerful. Everybody makes mistakes. What's important is that we learn from them. Claire realized that the pain she felt was now mingled with gratitude, a profound thankfulness toward Ethan, toward Robert Mitchell, and even toward this difficult moment itself. Because through this experience, painful as it was, she had learned something that would shape the rest of her life. Standing there in the quiet hum of the busy airport, Claire promised herself one final thing: that the person she would become from now on would be someone who truly understood and respected the dignity and worth of every human being. She would carry Ethan's forgiveness in her heart forever, as a gentle reminder of the kind of person she now knew she must strive to be. And as Claire turned to leave the terminal, stepping back out into the warm sunlight, she felt truly ready to begin again. This time, wiser, humbler, and infinitely more compassionate than she had ever been before. As we reach the end of this powerful story, there's an important message for each of us to take away. Every day, we're faced with choices about how we treat others. It's not simply about professional courtesy or customer service. It's about basic human kindness, fairness, and the courage to recognize and change our own biases and mistakes. We all carry unconscious assumptions and biases, but what truly matters is our willingness to confront and overcome them. It's about speaking up when we witness injustice, not remaining silent because it's comfortable or convenient. And most importantly, it's about our ability to acknowledge mistakes openly, accept responsibility, and genuinely commit to changing ourselves for the better. Today, Ethan's story teaches us that forgiveness can heal wounds, and that personal growth often comes from our most challenging moments. Claire's story reminds us of the power of humility and the strength found in accepting responsibility and striving to become better people. Now, we want to hear from you, our viewers. Have you ever witnessed a similar situation in your life, where someone faced unfair treatment or judgment based on assumptions? If you saw injustice happening right before your eyes, what would you do? Would you speak up or remain silent? Please, share your thoughts, feelings, and experiences in the comments section below. Your voice matters, and by sharing your perspective, you help foster deeper understanding and inspire positive change in others. If you found value in this story and its message, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more meaningful content like this. Let's continue this conversation and support each other in becoming better, more compassionate individuals every day. Thank you so much for watching, and we look forward to reading your thoughtful comments below.